Okay, this is for my third hour class on the 23rd of March. Test tomorrow, go back to the Spanish American War for review questions. I think most of the tests will probably be from the election of 1900 or the few years following the Spanish American War, the Little Brown Brothers, the establishment of the American Empire, and so forth. So, anyway, but today we're talking about Roosevelt's domestic policy. It's called the Square Deal. And the first thing you need to remember is that Teddy Roosevelt was a liberal. He was a liberal progressive. He was that thing in Oklahoma that we love to hate, the liberals. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was. He was a progressive. If you say someone's a progressive, that's just another way of saying they're a liberal. Then and now. And by the way, Teddy Roosevelt is the first progressive president. Get this down. Teddy Roosevelt kicks off what is known in American history as the Progressive Era. Okay, the Progressive Era, and it lasts from around 1900 to 1920, and then from 1920 until 1933, the country's going to turn conservative again during the Roaring Twenties, as they're called, and they elect 3 conservative Republican presidents. But at the end of the Roaring Twenties, in 1929, the Great Depression begins. And in the next presidential election, 1933, the American people will elect the greatest progressive of them all, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, the first progressive president. By the way, FDR is a Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt is a Republican. But Franklin Roosevelt, the greatest progressive president of them all, will enact the greatest progressive program of them all, and that is the New Deal. And Roosevelt will be president from 1933 until 1945. Okay, so that's a little quick history of progressivism there in this country. But anyway, Teddy Roosevelt is president. He was, as we've said before, he was young and he was dynamic. And what he meant by the square deal is he said, I want a square. He didn't say fair, you notice. You really need to look, people have that in their mouth. Oh, that's not fair. You need to really look up the definition of fair. I assure you, you don't want fairness. You know what fairness means. You get exactly what you deserve. Just think about that for a minute. You don't want fairness. But just look at that's not what Roosevelt said. He said he wanted a square deal for all. Get this down. Roosevelt was wealthy. And by the way, he said, here's the Industrial Revolution, making multimillionaires almost by the day. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not much. But he said, I have nothing against wealth. Get this down. As long as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller obey the law, I have nothing against wealth. What does he mean by as long as they abide by the law? As long as they pay their taxes, go and make billions. But the working class, the people, and again, here we go again, the producers of wealth, the people who are actually producing the wealth of Mr. Carnegie. Carnegie had the idea, but somebody's got to put that idea into effect. The people actually making Mr. Carnegie, today we would call it his billions, in those days millions, they had got to earn, get this down, Roosevelt said, a living wage. That means a decent life. And so who's going to be the referee between Andrew Carnegie, this multi-billionaire, and the people who are working down on the floor of his steel mills, according to Teddy Roosevelt and the Square Deal? Who's going to be the referee?
The government.
The government. Excellent. Write that down. The government. Listen, the progressives believe this. Get this in your little heads. The government must be an agent of reform. You can talk about reform all day long. You can come up with reform programs all day, but unless you have someone to enforce that reform, it's meaningless. So who can enforce it? According to Roosevelt and the progressives, the government. The government must be an agency of human welfare. That means the government must make sure everybody gets what they have earned. Okay? What they have earned. And by the way, Roosevelt got this down. He doesn't come up with all of these ideas by himself. There are a group of journalists. Journalists are people who write books. Journalists, usually we associate them with newspapers. And by the way, I've told you many times how important the newspapers were in this day. That was the main source of information from people. But journalists write magazines, they write books, they write magazine articles, I should say, they write books. Journalists mainly are in the newspaper industry, okay? But there were a group of journalists, and they are, get this down, they are progressives as well. They're progressive liberals, and they want change. They want change. And they are pointing out in their books, and I'm going to list some of them in a moment, in their books and in their newspaper articles and in their magazine articles, they're pointing out what's wrong with America. This is still, get this down, the Gilded Age. Listen to me, you know what the Gilded Age means, right? Yes? You know what I'm talking about when I say what's good on the, just beneath the surface, there's some real problems, okay? They said, this group of journalists said, these progressive journalists say, we are going to write about life under the guild. Under the guild. In other words, yeah, okay. You can look on the surface and say, well, everything in the United States is great. Look how we're progressing. More jobs, more wealth than ever, conquering the West. But the journalists of the Gilded Age say that ain't the whole story. You've got to dig beneath the gild, the glimmer, the shiny part, and see what the real problems are. And we're going to write about life under the guild. And they do that. And Teddy Roosevelt got this down. He's going to call these guys, though, you know, Roosevelt and these journalists agree. But they agree. Roosevelt says, yeah, we've got to cure these problems. We have to look under the guild, and when we find a problem, we've got to solve it. But Roosevelt said to them, he said, but here's the thing, the muckrakers say, we want it today. We want it now. Now we want it. The government must act now. And Roosevelt is saying, give me time. I'm trying to help you. Give me time. But the pressure from these people is relentless. They would not let up. And Roosevelt said about them, he called them muckrakers. It goes back to a book called Pilgrim's Progress. A character, I think, named John Bunyan. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all that. But what Roosevelt said, a muckraker, it was a man with a rake that raked through the garbage. Okay, that's what a muckraker is. And what Roosevelt's saying is, yes, if you dig deep enough, I'm trying to solve all these problems, but if you keep digging, the deeper you dig, the more problems will jump up. And you want it all solved today, and I can't solve it all today. You've got to give me time. And they criticize Roosevelt. They say he's not going fast enough. Roosevelt says to these, you've got to work with me instead of against me, or nothing is ever going to be done. And Roosevelt sort of viewed these guys as a threat. He calls them the muckrakers. Keep digging, dig deep enough, and the trash will always surface to the top. Okay, he called them the muckrakers. He said, in other words, I just thought, he said, you people are more interested in discovering problems and writing about it than you are in solving these problems. Because the more problems, the more shocking stories that you write, the more what?
People will buy your paper.
The people will buy your newspaper, or the people will buy your magazine, or the people will, you're exactly right, or the people will buy your books. You would rather identify problems. Roosevelt said, I'm over here. He said, I'm in government. I've got to grapple with the government and try and get government to act. You want to identify problems. I'm trying to solve them. Give me a break. Work with me. You understand that? So the muckrakers, okay? That's what Roosevelt called them. And I want you to write down some of the famous muckrakers, okay? Here we go. Here they are. And by the way, these aren't just, I think looking at this, any one of these, I'm going to give you some authors of books that were famous muckrakers, but any one of those you could probably, they're probably on, all of these are probably on sale in the OU bookstore this morning. And when you enroll in your, and not just OU, but I'm just using it for example, if you enroll in your history class, when they hand you out the syllabus, they'll say, here are the books that are required. You're going to read this semester. And you might have to go over and pick up 2 or 3 of these and read them, which is great. Okay. But here we go, right here. So here are some of, there are many of them. I've just picked out a few. Lincoln Steffens, write him down. Lincoln Steffens, okay, famous muckraker. And he wrote a book called The Shame of the Cities. And remember, I'm going to give you all books there. There are a lot of newspaper editors, a lot of magazines. The Shame of the Cities. What do you think he was talking about? What did he identify as the shame of the cities? And boy, that's a broad, there was a lot of shameful things going on in the city. The shame of the drug trade. That's not what he's talking about. There was a huge drug trade in the city. Child prostitution. I know we think we're the very first people, and we're going to talk about somebody that writes about that. Child prostitution. They estimate there were 100,000 male, 100,000 male little boys prostituting themselves in New York City. Just in New York City. 100,000. Anyway, the shame of the city. What do you think he's writing? So there are all sorts of shameful things going on in the city. What's he writing about? Due to time constraints, get this down. Bossism. He said, democracy. So we don't really have a democracy. This is what he said. He said, we don't really have a democracy in our cities. The bosses control, the big bosses, the Thomas Platts, the William Marcy Tweeds of the world. They control the vote of New York City and Chicago and all St. Louis and Dallas and all of these other major cities. And he said it's destroying democracy. Write this woman down and put a big star by her name, Ida Tarbell. Okay, she wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil. What's that about? What's she condemning? What is she saying exists in America that we need to get rid of?
Oil?
Huh? No, not oil. We needed oil. What? What was Standard Oil?
Carnegie?
No, and Carnegie. He's in steel. Who's the oil man?
Rockefeller?
Rockefeller. So what did Rockefeller done by the time she wrote this book? That's a big question. Over.
Monopolized oil.
What?
Monopolized.
Monopolies. Get them. Excellent. Write this down. This is a book saying the economy is controlled by these gigantic monopolies and trusts, and they need to be getting rid of because monopolies, she said, are destroying what? Competition. And what is the American way? She said, competition. How does the immigrant arrive here from Poland with just the clothes on his back or her back and eventually rise to the top, have a decent home, have a decent family, have a decent income, enough to eat, and live a good life? How do they do that? Through competition. And monopolies are destroying competition. That's what that book is about. I guarantee you that's on sale in the OU bookstore. Not on sale, but it's for sale in the OU bookstore this morning. And then this man wrote a book called Ray Stannard Baker wrote a book called Following the Color Line. What's that about? Following the Color Line. What's that?
Race.
Race. What particular about race? Yeah, it's about
Segregation.
Segregation. Write that down. They're exposing this. They're saying to Americans, do you know that this is going on? Well, Americans did know it. And they say that segregation needs to be gotten rid of. Okay? And then this man, Jacob Riis, who was an immigrant himself. I think he was from Denmark or Norway. He was Scandinavian. Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. How the Other Half Lives. What's that about?
Is it like the rich and the poor?
Huh?
Is it like the
Which
rich and
poor? It's about the poor. It's not about the rich, huh?
Immigrants?
Immigrants, yeah, immigrants. Those stories I've told you about entire families having to tie their babies to the bedstead and go work 12 hours for pennies and still not having enough to eat. Yeah. He said, you people that live outside the slums of the city, I'm going to take you on a tour of the slums. And by the way, get this down about Jacob Riis. He not only wrote He photographed. He took, you've heard the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, he took pictures, and you can still go buy books of Jacob Riis pictures, and it shocked America. It shocked them. Okay, how these millions of immigrants coming into the country were forced to live. That's not so supposed to happen in America, but they're writing beneath the gill. This is what's going on that you may or may not know about, or you're just ignoring and going on your way. You've got a good life, so you just assume everyone else does. Well, that's not true. I think if you ask a typical Oklahoman, how's life? I think we're in a new Gilded Age in a sense. I think if you ask a typical Oklahoma, how's things go? Oh, things going fine in Oklahoma. I've got a job, I've got a house, I've got a car, I've got enough to eat. We can go on vacation once a year, blah, 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 blah. I'm getting an education, blah, 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 blah. And if you said, well, what about the 30% of children in the state of Oklahoma who are, they call it today, food challenge. That's the silliest thing, food challenge. Why don't they just put their cards on the table? They don't have enough to eat. You got to dig beneath the gill, even in a little old state like Oklahoma, even in 2023. And that's what these people are writing about, okay? And then write this one down. Put a big star by this guy. And then a man named Upton Sinclair, very famous American. And he wrote a book called The Jungle. What do you reckon that was about, The Jungle? It's kind of difficult, The Jungle.
Is it just like the US overall, like all the problems?
No, that's an educated guess, but that's not it.
Something to do with like colonizing the West.
No, that's an educated guess as well. I see your point. I see both of your points. That's not it. Shocking if you knew this, but it's about the meat packing industry. It's about the food industry. Our meat is packed and processed by people. It's about, but especially meat. Okay, the jungle, the meat packing process. Okay, you understand that? The jungle. And then finally, Stephen Crane. We're going to come back to that. Put a big star by his name. Put a big star by her name. Stephen Crane. You ever heard of him? He wrote a book that you used to have to read to get out of the ninth grade. It's down in our library. If you want to build your brain, you ought to go. It's not a very long book. It's about the Civil War. It's called The Red Badge of Courage. I'm not giving anything away. But by the way, he was a muckraker. That's not the book he wrote as a muckraker. But The Red Badge of Courage, it was about a soldier. It's the first time he goes into battle and he runs. But later on he finds his courage and he becomes a pretty good soldier. But it's really an interesting book. Not very long. If you want to read something that will build your brain, that might be a suggestion for you. But Stephen Crane wrote this: Maggie, a girl of the streets. And this, as sometimes they say in these cop shows, this could be taken from today's headlines. Maggie, a girl, not girls, a girl of the streets. And it's about an Irish immigrant girl. She and her mother and her father come here. I think the father dies and the mother and the daughter are left alone. It's just a small girl. She's 12 or 14 years old. And then the mother dies and she's left on her own in the streets of New York. And to cut to the chase here, she is taken in by a pimp. She's forced into a life of prostitution. And so 12 or 14 years old, she's, forced into a life of prostitution. And finally, the story ends. It's a tragic story. The story ends. Her pimp beats her to death. Okay, her pimp beats her to death. These people were pointing out the problems in the United States. Okay, thank you. These people were pointing out the problems in the United States. So the progressives set out to solve these problems. Okay, and get this down. A lot of the progressives were socialists. Okay, that's a word we love to hate. We don't understand it. Everybody got all these. Everyone have all these. Okay. I don't think we sometimes understand socialism, but this man, write him down, Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette was a leading progressive in this country. He's an ally of Teddy Roosevelt's. In other words, he helps Roosevelt. He's a U.S. Senator. Bob La Follette Robert LaFollette. They called him Fighting Bob. He was from Wisconsin, okay? If you go to the state of Wisconsin and the history of Wisconsin, you know, and when he dies, his son takes over and so forth. I would not be surprised if not to this very day, there are LaFollettes in Wisconsin who are holding positions of authority. I don't know that for a fact, but I would be surprised. But he builds a political dynasty, okay? I think he was a governor, and then he's a senator, but he fought for progressive ideas. And by the way, he fought for socialism. Get this down. Now, under strict socialism, businesses would be owned by the government, okay? But under Wisconsin law, socialism, get this down. And by the way, Wisconsin, listen, get this down. In the progressive era, you know, here the progressives are saying we want to do all these things. We want women to vote. We want health care and so forth. We want housing for the homeless. From 1900 to 1920, those are the things that the progressives are fighting for. And during the progressive era, because of the efforts of Bob LaFollette, get this down, Wisconsin became a model state. In other words, it became an example, I guess, of what the progressives said they were trying to bring about in America. And Wisconsin was called the Wisconsin Ideal. In other words, if you want to see progressivism and socialism at work at its best, look to Wisconsin. It became a model of socialism, okay? And by the way, I want you to get this down. In Wisconsin, they're the first state to have an 8-hour day. And we just take that for granted today. Socialist Wisconsin. They're the first state to start cleaning up their sweatshops and saying you can't force people to work under conditions like this. They're telling big business that. That's the law today, by the way. That's the law today. They're the first state to enact the minimum wage. That's the law today. They're the first state. Let's think about this. This is the early 1900s. They're the first state to demand workman's comp. They are the first state to say that the government, the state government of Wisconsin, has the obligation to care for the elderly. What was that a forerunner of? That later on Franklin Roosevelt was going to enact into law. It's law today. What was that a forerunner of? Saying that the government had an obligation. Nobody had ever said that, but you know, if you got old, you better hope you saved enough money to take care of yourself until you go to the grave, because there ain't no help coming. Maybe your kids, but that's a big myth too, that the kids used. Some kids did, but the old in this country up until Franklin Roosevelt lived a pretty desperate life. You got too old to work. What was the program that Roosevelt enacted? It was a major part of the New Deal.
Social Security.
Social Security, that's exactly right. By the way, is that socialism? Social Security? What did Karl Marx, the founder of communism, say? Everybody contributes and then everybody takes out their fair share. Is that what people do in Social Security? Yeah, you want to see my Social Security cards? Red, white, and blue. But yeah, we all pay in and we all take it. Oh, that's communism. Oh, don't tell anybody. Yeah. Communism, it's the same idea, okay? Everybody pays in and everybody takes out. I said that, the student went home and told his grandpa, who was about my age, and he said, well, you go down there and ask that history teacher, I put all that money all those years into Social Security. It's just my money that I'm taking out. Let me tell you, you know how long you've got to be on Social Security for most people, I'm speaking in broad general terms, to draw everything out that you put in. I've been working 50 years. In those 50 years, how many years you got to draw Social Security out? About 5 years. And after I've drawn out everything I put in 50 years and 5 years, whose Social Security money are they going to be sending me then? Who's going to pay my Social Security? You are. You are. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly true. One generation always spends the next generation's Social Security. You make sure your kids get a good education and a good job, because they're supporting you. You don't look too happy about that. You're supporting me. Thanks. I appreciate it. Hurry up and get through school and college and get a really good job, because I'm going to be expensive. My generation, we're going to be expensive old people. So they got all sorts of medical wizardry to keep us alive forever. While you work like a sweat dog, paying our way. I'm pretty happy about that. So I don't look too crazy about that idea. But don't worry, you get to do it to the next generation. Anyway. Hey, the socialists in Wisconsin, that's what they were. They fought racism in the Ku Klux Klan. They pretty much ran it out of that state. And all these programs were funded by what? Where did the state government of Wisconsin, where did these socialists, where did this guy get this money to finance all this?
Taxes.
Taxes. In a socialist state, the taxes will be higher. Yeah, they're higher. They are one of the first states, maybe the first state, to implement the graduated income tax. The more you make, the more you pay. And by the way, La Follette and the socialists were not anti-capitalist. They didn't destroy capitalism, but they said this: capitalism has to play by the rules. There has to be rules. You're in the Gilded Age, capitalism ran pretty wild, but they said capitalism has to play by the rules. And government is going to control the things that people need. For example, in the early 1900s, vaccines are just coming in. And to get a vaccine, any sort of vaccine that existed at the time, in most states would cost you $3. That was a day's wages, $3. You know what that same vaccine cost you in Wisconsin? 3 cents. 3 cents. You know why? Because the socialists took over healthcare, and they said, we're not going to run healthcare for a profit. Everybody needs healthcare to live, and the government's going to run healthcare. We're going to take the profit out of healthcare. Okay? The socialists said, work hard and be responsible, but you're not on your own. You're not on your own. Government has a responsibility, not to take care of people from the cradle to the grave, not to pick you up every time you fall down. That's not what we're talking about. The government has a certain responsibility to people. Of course, today, and by the way, there was a lot of support in early Oklahoma. This is about the time of what I'm telling you. This is about the time Oklahoma was becoming a state. There was a lot of socialist support for socialism in the state of Oklahoma. We have the distinction today, boy, this would curl up the toes of these conservative Republicans that are running this state now. But we have the distinction of being the only state that a socialist revolution ever took place in. It was called the Green. I'm sure you've heard about it in your Oklahoma history. The Green Corn Rebellion, right? You've heard of that in your Oklahoma history? Yes? Yes? Let me rewind. You did take Oklahoma history.
Yeah.
How did you do in that class? Do you mind sharing your grade?
I think it was like a low A, I think.
Low A.
Yeah.
Well, you can tell me then what the Green Corn Rebellion, you've heard of that.
I feel like I have.
You feel like you have. You have this feeling. It's a warm and fuzzy feeling.
It sounds familiar.
It sounds really, yes, I understand. Yeah. Well, what grade you in?
100.
A 100. Well, then you can certainly inform me and Mr. Moore.
Got 100 too.
The Green Corn Rebellion. Shocking. Well, I'm not shocked. Well, we'll talk more about it later. But during World War I, while this country was at war, a bunch of socialists, and it's right here in McIntosh County, from about Stigler, roughly Stigler to Norman, a bunch of farmers, black farmers, white farmers, Native American farmers, they get their draft notices to go fight over in Germany, and they said, we're not going. Germany hadn't done anything to us. And they go out in the woods and hide, and they arm themselves. They have to send federal marshals in here to shoot it out with them. It's called the Green. It's the only socialist rebellion in the history. And where did it happen? In good old rock-ribbed, conservative Oklahoma, Republican Oklahoma. Socialist. Have you said that to a lot of, well, here's what I'm calling now. This might be important. Hello? Hello? How are you? Oh, good. Anyway, it happened in good old rock-ribbed Republican Oklahoma. If you went over to the state capitol and you told that to a bunch of those Republicans, they would probably jump off the dome over there. But this used to be a pretty heavily socialist state. By the way, was William Jennings Bryan pretty socialist? Sure was. And we got a county right down here not far from us, Bryan County, named after the state name. It was he was a hero here. Yeah, socialism. Now, of course, why do we hate socialism today? Because guess what? In 1917, and you don't have to write this down now, we'll go about it in great, but just looking ahead, in 1917, the communists overthrew the government of Russia and created, right in the middle of World War I, right at about the same time as the Green Corn Rebellion, the Russians overthrew, the communists overthrew the Russian government and created the first communist nation in history, which was called the Soviet Union, which lasted until 1991. You understand? And of course, the man who led the Russian Revolution was Nikolai Lenin, and of course he died, and he was taken over by one of the greatest mass murderers in history, Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin rules the Soviet Union for 30 years, and in 30 years he probably killed 50 million people. Russians, okay? That's why we're running out of Russians. They've never recovered from Joe Stalin. He killed millions, slaughtered innocent people, butchered them in the name of communism. Somebody comes up and talks to you about communism, just remember this: it took 200 million deaths to create communism. 200 million deaths, innocent people slaughtered, okay? But Karl Marx, who created communism, yes, Karl Marx. We've talked about him, haven't we? Well, we will. Don't worry about it. Karl Marx, M-A-R-X, a German Jew who created communism, talked about socialism. And when the communists took over the Soviet Union and started carrying out mass murder, in the minds of the American people, those two things just melded together: socialism and communism. And both of them became evil. Now, I'm not a socialist. I'm a capitalist. I believe in the free enterprise system. I believe you ought to make as much money as you can. I think that's just fine. But I also understand that communism and socialism are two separate things. If we decided tomorrow to go to socialism, you would still have free speech. You would still have freedom of religion. You'd still have, here we go, the right to bear arms. I got to throw that in there because to some people they would give up their free speech to own an assault weapon. That's amazing to me. But anyway, yeah. Communism, different kettle of fish. But socialism, yeah. They're two distinct things. And again, I'm not a socialist. I am a capitalist. I believe in capitalism. I think it's raised, with all of its flaws, and Lord knows it's got flaws, but I think it's raised more people out of poverty than any economic system in history. So I'm a capitalist. But I also believe this: capitalism has to be regulated. There have to be rules. In other words, if you someday start a multi-trillion-dollar company, you're going to have to, I believe that the law ought to tell you, yes, Miss Eford, you're starting this you've made trillions of dollars, you make Elon Musk look like a beggar, but you have to pay the people working for you. It's the law that you've got to pay the people working for you their rightful share of your fortune. I believe that has to happen. I don't think they can just say, you're the boss, pay whatever you want. I think capitalism has to be regulated. But listen, just to understand this, and we'll talk more about it, socialism is just this idea that there are certain things that all people need to live, like health care, right? We've done this before, haven't we? Yeah. And the government ought to run those things. And socialists would say the government ought to run the big oil companies. They ought to own them. You shouldn't be able to, the government ought to own the airlines. The government ought to own the telephone companies and deliver that service to you as cheaply as as they possibly can. That's socialism. It's an economic system. Communism is an economic system, and I'm not going to go into that today. We'll talk more about communism later, but I just want you to understand they're two separate things, and people confuse that all the time. So anyway, socialism became a dirty, dirty word. But I want to tell you this, get this down. Most of the progressives, most of the people who are leaders in this progressive era are Republicans. I want you to write this down. The Republican Party was the liberal. Today, Republicans hate liberals. Oh my God! If you're in a room full of Republicans and there's not a chair to sit down in, and you want to sit down, just shout liberal. They'll jump out of the windows, and you can have any seat in the house. They hate liberals. And in the early part of the 20th century, during the progressive era, it was led by progressive liberal Republicans. And I want you to write down a few of them in case you ever see these people's names. These are powerful U.S. senators. Hiram Johnson of California, he was a liberal progressive Republican. William Borah, I think his name was William Borah of Idaho. Borah, let's see if that. Yeah, William Borah. And then this man, maybe, was the greatest progressive Republican of them all, George Norris. I mean, the big star by his name, George Norris of Nebraska. And these are all the people who support Teddy Roosevelt, and they are the leaders of the progressive era. And just one more time, look at all the things from 1900 to 1920 that we got from liberal progressives. Conservatives didn't come up with this. The graduated income tax, workman's compensation, the minimum wage, you've heard me say this so many times, you're blue in the face, and so am I. The 40-hour work week, the right of women to vote, and eventually health care, Medicare, Medicaid, Sooner Care. All of those things come from the progressive liberals, okay? And that's what Republicans were. I'm not saying there were no conservative Republicans, but the majority, the Republican Party, and by the way, get this down too, it was the party of civil rights. How in the world can I leave that out? Which party today is considered to be the party of civil rights? Democrat, yeah. And Republicans, we Republicans, and it's our own fault, we keep shooting ourselves in the foot. Republicans are viewed as people that hate women. They're just a bunch of old white men. They hate women. They hate Asian Americans. They hate Hispanic Americans. They hate African Americans. They hate Native Americans. We just hate. That's how we're viewed today. But I want to tell you what, we were the party of civil rights when Teddy Roosevelt was president of the United States. Also, get this down. Teddy Roosevelt, now listen to me carefully. Teddy Roosevelt is often called Teddy the Trust Buster. Okay, the Trust Buster. Write that down. I've actually seen the chapter in a textbook covering Teddy Roosevelt entitled that what am I looking for where they have what the book's about? In the table of contents. Is that what it is? The chapters, what each chapter is, table of contents. It's called Teddy the Trust Buster. The trust is the monopoly. Write this down. Teddy the Trust Buster. And if you look, and he's called that. If you look at that, you would think that Roosevelt spent all of his time doing what?
Lying.
What?
What was the question again?
If you look at that, what do you think Teddy the Trust Buster means? What did I say a trust was?
Monopoly.
Okay, so just going by that, what would you?
Destroying the monopoly.
All he did was destroy, get this down. If you go by that, which is wrong, if you go by that, you would think that Teddy Roosevelt just hated all trust, and all he did as president was sit around figuring out which trust he could destroy. And that's not true. Here's what Roosevelt believed about trust. And when I say trust, I'm talking about monopolies. Trust is synonymous with, there's a slight difference. A monopoly is usually owned by John D. Rockefeller. A trust, one man. A trust is where two or three people who own large companies come together and create one gigantic company. But it's still a monopoly. It's just run by three people. When that happens, it's called an industrial combination. You understand that? Yes? Okay. Well, here's what Teddy Roosevelt believed about monopolies. Get this down. He believed there were good ones and bad ones. He believed there were good ones and bad ones. He said good monopolies played by the rules. Good monopolies, just a second. Good monopolies paid their employees a living wage. Good monopolies. Obeyed the law. So what did he say to do with good monopolies? What did he say to do about good monopolies?
Leave them alone.
Leave them alone. Because, by the way, they're creating jobs. They're good for the country. Can you think of any monopolies today? Big corporations that there's really no competition to them. They deliver a product.
Amazon.
Amazon would be one. You know, during the pandemic, Jeff Bezos created 500,000 jobs. It's 500,000 jobs. And by the way, they're good paying jobs. What would Teddy Roosevelt call Amazon? Would he want to break it up? What would he say?
It's a
Good monopoly. But what did he say about bad monopolies? Huh? Break them. Now you gotta get that down. Make them break up. And I know the bell is ringing, but let me give you one quick example. The Northern Securities case. This is an example of Roosevelt taking on a bad monopoly. The Northern Securities case. It involved railroads, and let me tell you something, anything in 1905 that involved railroads involved the whole country. Up in the far northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, three men owned the railroads up there. And they were enormously wealthy. And they combined all three of those. Get this down. They created what was called a trust, or an industrial combination. And Roosevelt said, that won't work. And the most famous case, Roosevelt broke up, when he was president, get this down, he broke up 44 monopolies. He forced them to, and by break it up, I mean, he forced them to sell off their stocks. 44 monopolies. But the most famous case is that one right there. He made them break that combination up because he said, by coming together and forming this one gigantic railroad company, you destroyed competition. And he wasn't going to let that happen. So if anybody ever asks you for an example of Teddy busting up a trust, the Northern, it should be Northern, not North. It should be Northern. Okay, well, I don't know if I can spell it right. Your test will go down to there. My friends again. Hello. How are you?
No, like
Remember anything?
Georgetown is high up there. Watch you. Watch Gracie's getting all that.
Gracie always looks like food or something. He's always eating all this stuff.
I didn't even know they played this sport. They're playing at Oakland.
Yeah,
It's like a tournament.
I was going on Facebook and it said you follow Iron or you follow softballs live and they're playing at Oklahoma, so we turned it on and just let us play.
Yeah, I didn't even know they played this sport. It's probably not.
Right, which one did you leave out? Political or social?
Economic.
You left out that one?